I wanted to thank you all for, it's great to be back in Ohio, virtually, if not physically. One of my fave states. But I wanted to also introduce you to David Slazer. He's with Axiomatic out of New Hampshire. Dave and his firm and my firm have done a lot of work with statewide parcel efforts across the country. I think Dave can talk to that more directly, but you're going to really enjoy working with Dave and Pat and the folks at Axiomatic. They're the heavy duty technical dudes, and I appreciate them very much. They do excellent work. What we want to talk about today is just, I told Tom yesterday, my problem with parcel data is that it's hard for me to be brief. I can talk about it forever, and I'm going to try to be brief with you on it, but ask questions and whatever comes up, just throw it in the chat or ask Tom, whatever, we'll stay and answer questions as long as we need to. But statewide parcel data, so it sounds like a pretty easy concept, right? Like we just have, oh, here's all the 6+ million parcels of Ohio, all in a single database. What could be so hard about that? Well, it's a little bit, of course, it's highly nuanced. And is it just the GIS features? Is it the GIS and the CAMA features? And I think Ohio features almost 8 or 9 different assessment and CAMA systems. So is it all of the attributes from all of those CAMA systems? Do we just take all the GIS and tie it to related tables? Is it the Register of Deeds records? Is it the data that Frank was talking about? Do we need to know from a perspective of managing all the waterways in Ohio? Do we need to know statewide impervious surfaces? Do we need to know every building footprint? Do we need to know the mortgage situation across Ohio? Harking back to the keynote address. So it's, when we say statewide parcel data, it sounds easy, but it's always more complicated than that. So one of the things we're going to be looking at as we start working with the state of Ohio and identifying kind of what the statewide parcel data might look like, we're going to be looking at what's included in that, what level of attribution is in there, and how extensive the data sets are that go with the statewide data. So the simplest form, so this is a little inventory that we keep track, and this was originally funded by a Southeastern Appalachian project when we came in and built a GIS inventory for the state of Ohio, and we'll continue to maintain it to a certain extent. This isn't absolutely current, but it's pretty current. And we are trying to track sort of what is the status of the GIS data. Are the parcels automated in a GIS, or are they in a CAD? Are they tied to a CAMA system? Are they tied to a Register of Deeds system? Are they tied to a tax billing system? So all those different characteristics of things that make up the parcel. Basically what we're looking for, here is the range of assessment data that is typically maintained in a typical assessment office. And what we're looking to do is identify what are the commonalities across all 88 counties that would allow us to build a reasonable picture of Ohio at the parcel granularity, so that we can support some of those applications that Dave is going to show you that are possible. Axiomatic has done this already in a whole bunch of states. I'm going to let Dave talk about that, but the number of applications we can get for Ohio is just astounding. And this is kind of where Ohio fits in the scheme of things. If this color is green, that's generally good. That means you either have parcel data at some level and have it published. Blue means that you're well on the way, that you either have it already aggregated, although it may not be publicly available, but it is aggregated in some way. The lighter blue and the kind of the whatever color that is, pink or purple, are states that are quite a bit behind the curve. Are states where we are really struggling in terms of getting the automated parcel data up and running. When we talk about statewide parcel data, one of the things that I know, I mean, my background in engineering and surveying, I know that we fight the tendency to have the highest detail the most current, the highest accuracy at all points in time. And as I've gotten older, I've learned that in fact that's not necessary. That it isn't necessary for all decisions to have the most accurate, most detailed, most current information. That a lot of decisions, as you spread out from parcel by parcel decisions to decisions that are based on a city level, a response to a tornado, or a flooding event, or to manage a state oil permitting program, you don't need the level of detail and the accuracy to manage those programs effectively. You can get a lot of efficiency without burdening the state parcel program. And so the other thing that we work carefully on is trying to ascertain what is the correct level of detail, accuracy, and currency to support the various state programs and the various state needs. So that's another thing that we're going to need to come in and talk to all of you about. And of course, the other thing is that how many of you hear this? Yeah, great idea. Yeah, but what about this thing? And in a lot of cases, that sort of stops the project. The yeah, but sort of stop the project. It's like, yeah, I can go along. Yeah, but I don't, I'll run a race with you, Tom, but I don't really want to run that far, or yeah, I'm interested in that, but I don't really have any tennis shoes that'll work. So, I mean, it's the yeah, buts that we need to be cognizant of, and we need to address and catch ourselves on. So counties are going to use different coding. They're going to use different parcel identifiers. They're going to identify uses differently. They're going to have different zoning ordinances from municipality to municipality. They're going to have different definitions of what is value. They're going to have different definitions of even what a tax parcel is and what they capture. It's okay. It's okay. For the statewide decisions, we don't need to have every single thing be the same. So the statewide program is not saying, it's not top down and imposing on every county that you have to change what you do to match the state. What happens is we look at what the county has, and then you have to tell us what your codes mean, and then we normalize all of the counties to some sort of a standard so that it can be used. But we're not imposing a standard definition on each county. And not every county even has GIS parcels, and that's okay too. There's a lot of new tech coming out with ArcGIS Pro and some of the web-based tools where if we can get any kind of geometry at all, we can get that into a way that we can present that on a map. And if we just don't have any, we're working in a state now where we have 4 or 5 counties that don't even have polygons. And we're able to use address points and centroids based on legal descriptions to at least get a dot for every parcel. So there's a lot of things that we can do that don't require every county to have a highly rigorous GIS. For those of you that manage the legal side of things, the statewide parcel map is not the grantor grantee index. It's not going to be a substitute for doing the research, the hard research in the Register of Deeds office or in the county clerk records and in the court records. It's not going to be the zoning map. So the uses that are shown on these maps are the tax assessment uses. It's not land use control. It's not zoning. And of course, the all-important disclaimer is that this is not a legal conveyance document. So these are sort of the yeah buts that we've been getting typically that offer resistance from data stewards about sharing their data with the state to be able to make a statewide system. We've addressed those issues. I think you won't have any concerns with those issues when you see what can happen. What I'd like to do is pass the presentation over to my colleague, David Salzar. David has done some incredible magic in 3 or 4 of the states that we've worked together on, and you are going to be so pleased with what you see here. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Nancy. And thank you everyone for taking the time today. So Nancy and I were just talking recently about different uses of statewide parcels. And so that's what I'm going to kind of cover here in about 10 minutes or so, or, you know, in the 5 or 6 states we've worked in doing statewide parcel work, what kind of uses we've seen. And it's funny because even after doing this for almost 15 years, you find new uses pop out all the time for parcel data. So really just starting off here, I'm showing, you know, the fundamental foundational use that we see for every state we help aggregate their data. And that's having a statewide parcel viewer that's really no different than your countywide parcel data viewer, except it now goes across all the boundaries. You know, and that's a really critical item for so many states, is just starting there. So this is really what the foundational use. And I like to use an example here. This is New Mexico. We have ETLs running in New Mexico. They aggregate their data twice a year, and they're in their 5th year of aggregation. But what it really boils down to is an example like this. You have 2 counties bordering each other, Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque, and then Sandoval County and the city of Rio Rancho, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the state. And they border each other, and if you were driving down the road, you wouldn't notice you travel from one county to the next. But they run different assessment systems. They have different parcel mapping standards, and essentially, you know, when anyone was trying to do any type of study with data, they would have to figure out how to merge those 2 layers together. You know, but through the ETL process, you get seamless data sets. And we do a lot of work in the revenue space, Department of Revenue space. So this is looking at taxable value of parcels, you know, irrespective now of those county boundaries. And we like to use this as just a fundamental example of 2 jurisdictions that run right into each other, where prior to having this aggregated data, anyone who wanted to use it for any type of analysis or work would really have to struggle to bring that together. A lot of different uses in different agencies. We're going to focus kind of at the state level and different state agencies, and transportation specifically is a huge user of data. Identifying state-owned land. This is an example in New Hampshire where we've been aggregating data for over 10 years with our ETLs, where they built an extension from the airport to the turnpike, and the number of towns they had to go through. In New Hampshire, they do data aggregation at the town level, so they have 250 jurisdictions that get compiled. But essentially the ability to compile the data, and then for the DOT to understand what parcels they owned, and now that the project's finished, how they're going to parse those parcels out and sell excess land. And the treasurer in Ohio has a great website for looking at state-owned land, but you also need that context of privately owned land, especially when you're planning a project or you know, doing any type of corridor study. We see a lot of transportation uses through abutter notifications as projects are starting, going out and making sure they know who to they should be notifying about disruptions related to projects. In natural resources, we do a lot of work in New Mexico with their oil and gas data and helping them track drilling activity and the actual parcels that it's occurring on. So they take information from their Department of Natural Resources and overlay it on the parcel data. They look at permit compliance. They also use task satellites to look at, you know, potential violations of permit activity when people are working on state or federal land, and then they decide they're going to, you know, work on land that they might not actually have a lease on. One of the big uses is pipeline abutter safety management. So who abuts the pipelines, and this is, you know, just a small snippet of an app we run in New Mexico where they can look at all the different oil and gas data, and then down here at the bottom it summarizes all the parcels that are under the pipeline and abut it, so they can quickly look at a pipeline section and understand who's associated with it. And in New Mexico, there are tens of thousands of miles of pipeline. And I know Ohio, you have a lot of pipeline and oil and gas activity happening there as well. So parcel data is a huge assistance to that. Public safety. This is what actually drove New Hampshire to build their parcel map. This is a simulated image, but at the time, it was 2007, there was a tornado that went through 12 towns in New Hampshire, and they had no ability to go in and actually assess the damage and understand what property was there prior to this. So the ability to conduct the damage assessment and now use it for disaster preparedness and understanding when potential things might happen, what the impact of that might be. We know in some states, the state police will use it for warrant service, understanding who owns properties, when they're in the process of actually going out and serving a warrant. And we see it used a lot for 911 data enhancement. So many states where we aggregate parcel data, they have good 911 data, but it also helps them understand address locations and address points and provides them another layer to work with. Agricultural use is a big one. Every state I feel like is a big agriculture state. This is in Vermont, where we help them with their statewide parcel aggregation. This is looking at current use, which is either agriculture or timber harvest land. We've done a lot with food security mapping. This kind of overlaps into the Department of Safety, but looking at where permitted ag biosolids being placed for fertilizer. Important water safety issue, which is big in Vermont, and I think is a big Ohio item as well, is preserving historic farmland. So we see a lot of different ag uses going on. We also see a lot of uses with historical buildings, that kind of dovetails from farmland preservation, historical societies and the Department of Natural Resources or historical resources in the state trying to manage all of their locations. Personally, this is the space that we spend most of our time in, and this is what drives a lot of the states we aggregate data with, is their property tax oversight that happens at the state level, whether they're doing equalization, doing sales tax compliance. In New Mexico, the state does a lot with annually evaluating performance of the assessors, and they use this data to help them in that process. The sales tax compliance one has become bigger, and we see more and more states talking about that. Obviously, with point of sales tax and being able to identify any local sales taxes that have to be applied, on top of the state sales tax. Economic development. We see the Departments of Economic Development use this data frequently for business site selection. So the ability to look for data of a certain classification, whether it's commercial or residential property, certain land area, proximity to the highway. This is just doing a search in a particular county, looking at commercial properties that are between 10 and 15 acres. And then those can, potentially allow you to help pick some to drive business. This has become, more and more of a focus with things like Amazon trying to locate their facilities. But just having this data available for your own economic development department to help drive business into the state is always advantageous. One of the bigger uses is environmental services as well. This is looking at sea level rise in New Hampshire and looking at FEMA floodplain data. But one of the biggest things we've seen is for non-point source pollutants in private well testing. So there's been a lot of issues with well water contamination and the ability to actually understand where the private wells are and associate them with parcels so that the Department of Environmental Services can aggregate their sampling data and make sure that they're sampling correctly. There's been a lot of PFAS and PFOA, which is all oil and gas and plastics generation related. I talked about the ag biosolid tracking, and I even got a call about one recently in New Mexico with septic mapping. The state was trying to map all the septic tanks in the state, and being able to look at the parcel data and know who has improved property and who doesn't, help them eliminate all kinds of data qualifications that they needed to do. We've seen the Air National Guard use it to understand who abuts their facilities. In some states, you call them wildlife management. New Hampshire, they call them fish and game. Forest rangers use this data in New Hampshire to look at different things when they're out in the field. I mean, there's just so many different uses: hunting management, fishing management, timber management. It's endless. Like Nancy said, it's hard to just talk for 10 minutes. But I wanted to give a quick smattering of the different types of statewide uses that this data gets. And it's important to note that this does not supplant the local data maintainers. The goal is to aggregate basic information to be used for planning purposes. And with good ETLs in place, when the state does have an urgent need for really up-to-date data, they can just request updated files from the local jurisdiction and run them through the process. So the goal is to have some type of annual aggregation, and then the ability to do on-demand aggregation as different projects call for it. So I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So I'm going to stop here, Nancy, unless you had something else you want to add in.
I really like this last slide a lot, Dave. It's what we're finding in South Carolina, and I don't know that's happening in Ohio. I've been in the South for so long, I've sort of forgotten my Midwestern roots, but as farms are consolidating and there are more developers coming onto land, we're finding that the septics and the wells are becoming a significant factor because we've lost sight of where they are. And then an old well will mysteriously show up in the middle of a development because farmland is, we're growing houses instead of corn on a lot of farmland in the South, and personally distressing, but this kind of data is really important for that, keeping track of what happened before the developer got there.
So again, if there's anybody that has any questions for Nancy or David, feel free to throw those in the chat. We did have a question that Nancy addressed in the chat. How do you deal with topology issues across counties, such as overlaps in parcels? Nancy, do you want to address that one, verbally, I guess, I know you have it in writing there, but it's sort of a case-by-case basis. And I personally think it's an area where counties need to start, reaching across the county lines with their neighbors and starting to, look at that issue, but needs to be made apparent, right, where those issues are, and agreements have to be made, right?
Right. So the idea is to use the statewide data set to identify, like you just said, Tom, to identify where there may be concerns, and then the data stewards are the ultimate authority on the data production, data quality, and the data aggregator, who's also an authoritative source. The data aggregator is not some schmuck. I mean, it's an authoritative source that's built from the data stewards, but the data aggregator would never edit the data that's provided, and it's not a question of grading it and handing it back. It's a question of saying, hey, here's an area that you might want to look at with your neighbor to see if you all have things identified correctly, because it's just fair to the landowner in terms of revenue. And ultimately out of that, what's going to come is improved county boundaries and even improved city boundaries. So the overall quality of the parcel data will improve by the data stewards making improvements, because they will see data quality issues as data is emerged. For example, we just worked in a county in New Mexico with this project that Dave talked about yesterday. And we found 3,000 parcels out of 18,000 parcels that were not accounted for correctly in the CAMA system. That'll be a significant revenue resource for that rural county eventually.
Right, and these boundary issues, Nancy, if I know that you've worked heavily with census, but I think data gets incrementally better as the years go on, and so where we identify these issues with parcels and boundaries, identifying the order of magnitude and where these problems exist allows us to strategically put together a plan to rectify those things. So I think pulling back the curtain and sort of showing where these issues are, I think is an important part of this, and I believe that this data aggregation is going to do just that, right? Is identify the areas where the problems exist.
Absolutely, and Dave mentioned this in passing, but it's a very important thing, is the ability to identify a project that crosses state or crosses county boundaries, identify that as a project area, select those areas that are in those parcels that are in the project area, post those back to the data stewards and say, hey, we need more current information in this area because we've just had some flooding, or we've got a wildland fire, or we've got a tornado. We need a little bit more current information for just this area. So
right.
I'm gonna let Donovan speak to the state of Ohio projects. I don't know what we're at liberty to discuss on that, so I'll leave that to Donovan. Are there any efforts in identifying easements? No. This project is not going to include easements. And you can imagine all of the reasons why. What is an easement? When does an easement constitute taxable change? Easements are so daggum complicated. You know, I like to start with maybe the road, you know, ingress and egress easements, and then maybe move on to conservation easements. But each one of those almost needs a separate project so that each of the counties can get a sense of how they're being defined, and are they even collecting them, and how are they accounting for them. So an important area for sure, particularly for things like hunting and fishing and ingress and egress and conservation. Absolutely an important aspect of land ownership in the United States, but not something that we're going to tackle right out the bat. So my husband and I always said that these things are built, we call it the Egyptian method. It's one block at a time. When they built the pyramids, they didn't start at the top. They started with that first layer of rock. And that's what we're doing here, is we're laying down that first base, and then we'll build up. So I hope I'm here long enough to see you get easement.